They tore her clothes off in front of everyone, calling her a gold digger who didn't deserve their son. Her mother-in-law laughed as she stood there, humiliated and broken. But what they didn't know, her father was watching everything, and he was about to show them who she really was. Stay until the very end because the revenge her father delivered will leave you speechless. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Emma Chen stood in aisle 3 of the Princeton Whole Foods, comparing organic tomatoes like her life depended on it. She wore a faded Stanford hoodie, kept deliberately because it was the only designer thing she allowed herself, and jeans with a frayed hem. Her cart held the careful budget of someone who counted pennies, store-brand pasta, day-old bread, a single chicken breast. 3,000 miles away, her father's chef was preparing Wagyu beef in a Malibu kitchen the size of this entire store. She didn't think about that anymore, couldn't afford to. Not if this experiment was going to work. Not if she was finally going to find someone who looked at her, just her, without seeing dollar signs reflected in her eyes. The tomato in her hand was perfect. She smiled, dropped it in her cart, turned toward checkout, and collided with a man holding overflowing grocery bags. Oranges exploded across the floor. His coffee splashed his shirt. Emma's carefully selected tomato rolled under a display of artisan crackers she'd never let herself buy. "God, I'm so sorry," they said in unison, then laughed. He had kind eyes, that's what she noticed first. Warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners, the kind that came from genuine smiling, not the practiced charm of men who'd learned to perform affection. "I'm James," he said, kneeling to gather oranges. "And apparently I'm a walking disaster." "Emma." She crouched beside him, their hands brushing as they both reached for the same fruit. "I've had worse collisions. In grocery stores. In life." Something passed between them then, a recognition she couldn't name. Like finding something she hadn't known she'd been searching for. 200 miles south in Short Hills, New Jersey, Patricia Morrison stood in her colonial home's formal dining room, running a white-gloved finger along the mahogany table. She found dust. Her jaw tightened. "James is bringing someone to dinner," her husband Robert called from his study, voice thick with the bourbon he'd started drinking at noon. "That teacher girl. Again." Patricia's reflection stared back from the china cabinet glass, a woman fighting age with Botox and bitterness, losing both battles. "How lovely," she said, the words sharp as cut crystal. "I'll make sure to use the second-best silverware." She'd clawed her way from a Newark apartment to this house, this zip code, this veneer of respectability. No public school teacher with thrift store dresses was going to drag her family back down. Not on her watch. Not ever. Have you ever hidden who you really were to find real love? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your story. 6 months dissolved like sugar in rain. Dates at Princeton Battlefield Park where they walked until sunset painted the sky amber and gold. Late-night conversations in her cramped apartment where James never once commented on the peeling wallpaper or the radiator that clanked like a dying engine. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market where he'd buy her wildflowers because they match your smile. He proposed at Liberty State Park with Manhattan's skyline glittering across the Hudson like a promise, the ring modest but chosen with thought, a simple band that caught the light just right. "Marry me," he'd whispered, and she'd said yes, believing she'd finally found it, love without price tags, connection without contracts. Then came dinner with the Morrisons. Patricia opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, gaze cataloging Emma's Target dress with the precision of an appraiser finding a forgery. "A teacher," she said, the word hanging in the air like spoiled milk. "How charitable of you, James." The dining room smelled of expensive candles and older money, or at least the desperate performance of it. Robert held court at the head of the table, name-dropping acquaintances from Balterall Golf Club between sips of wine that cost more than Emma's monthly rent. "So your family's from where, dear?" Patricia asked, cutting her fillet with surgical precision. "California," Emma said carefully. "And they do. My father's in technology." "Oh." Patricia's smile sharpened. "One of those tech support types. How industrious." James's hand found Emma's under the table, squeezed once, but he said nothing, his silence filling the space where his defense should have been. Emma felt something crack inside her chest, hairline fracture she tried to ignore. "We'll handle the wedding costs, of course," Patricia continued, patting her lips with a monogrammed napkin. "Since I assume your people don't have much to contribute. Short Hills does have standards to maintain." The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, loud, relentless, marking each second of James's continued silence. "That's very generous," Emma managed, the words tasting like ash. Patricia beamed. We take care of our own. Even the strays James brings home. Robert laughed, a wet, bourbon-soaked sound. At least she's pretty, son. Pretty covers a multitude of sins. Emma's fingers tightened around her fork until her knuckles went white, but she kept her face serene, kept her voice steady. Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Morrison. Oh, call me Patricia, dear. That smile again, all teeth and no warmth. We're going to be family, after all, whether we like it or not. James drove her home in silence, the unspoken words between them heavy as stones. She just needs time, he finally said, pulling up to her apartment. She'll come around. Emma looked at him, really looked, and saw what she'd been too in love to notice. A man who'd learned long ago that keeping peace meant choosing sides, and he'd never choose hers. Sure, she said softly. Time. But she already knew. She'd give them rope, let them hang themselves with it. Let them show her exactly who they were, so when the moment came, and it would come, there'd be no doubt, no mercy, no way back. The humiliations came in waves after that, small cruelties dressed up as concern, insults wrapped in silk. Patricia insisted on the Pleasantdale Chateau for the venue, then made sure every guest knew James's family is covering everything since the bride's people have nothing. She threw an engagement party at a Connecticut vineyard, introduced Emma to every guest as James's little teacher girlfriend, with a pat on the head like she was a rescued puppy. Robert joked over cocktails that Emma had probably never been to Cape Cod. Too expensive for her sort, you understand, while his country club friends laughed into their gin and tonics. Emma endured it all with a smile that grew sharper each time, a blade she was honing for the moment she'd need it. James noticed. Of course he did. But his protests came only in private, whispered apologies in the dark that meant nothing when dawn broke and his mother called. They are just protective, he'd say, hands running through his hair in that anxious gesture she'd once found endearing. They don't know you like I do. Then help them know me, Emma would reply, and he'd look away, look anywhere but at her, and she'd understand all over again. He'd never fight for her, not really, not when it meant standing against the people who'd taught him that appearances mattered more than truth. She could have ended it, should have, maybe, could have walked away, found someone with a spine, someone who'd choose her over comfort. But something in her had calcified during those 6 months, something cold and patient that wanted to see how far they'd go, how much they'd reveal. She'd spent her whole life watching people perform for her father's money. Now she was watching people perform their cruelty when they thought she had none. It was almost educational. Patricia called her at work one Tuesday, Emma's classroom still full of third graders working on multiplication tables, to inform her that the dress Emma had chosen for the rehearsal dinner was inappropriate for the venue's standards. Something simple would be better, Patricia said, voice dripping with false sweetness. You do own something simple, don't you? Or should I send you something from my closet? We can have it taken in, make it fit. Emma's students looked up at her sudden silence, the way her jaw clenched. That's thoughtful, Emma managed, but I'll handle it. Just trying to help, dear. We can't have you embarrassing James at his own rehearsal dinner. First impressions matter, even if you're making them 6 months late. The line went dead. Emma stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, while her students waited for her to continue the lesson, and something inside her that had been bending finally locked into place, unbendable, unbreakable. Let them come, she thought. Let them do their worst. They had no idea who they were dealing with. What would you do if your partner stayed silent while their family humiliated you? Let me know in the comments. Would you stay or walk away? The rehearsal dinner arrived like an execution date, Manhattan's Upper East Side, a venue dripping with old money and older prejudices, the kind of place where the waiters moved like ghosts and every surface gleamed with the shine of inherited wealth. Emma chose her dress with surgical precision, a cream-colored vintage Valentino she'd found in her own closet back in California, simple enough to pass as unremarkable, expensive enough that its destruction would be a crime. She'd had it shipped to her Princeton apartment in unmarked packaging, hung it in her closet next to the Target clearance items like a secret weapon waiting for deployment. Patricia had invited over 100 guests, turning what should have been an intimate family gathering into a social showcase, another opportunity to display her son like a trophy she'd polished to perfection. James picked Emma up at 6, his nervousness bleeding through his cologne. You look beautiful, he said, but his eyes were already elsewhere, scanning for his mother's approval before they'd even arrived. The venue blazed with crystal chandeliers and ego, guests clustered in groups determined by net worth and social standing, their laughter sharp as breaking glass. Emma recognized the hierarchy immediately, She'd grown up in rooms like this, knew how to read the subtle gradations of power and performance. Patricia held court near the bar. Her dress cost more than most people's cars, her smile predatory as she spotted them entering. "There's the happy couple," she announced, loud enough to draw attention. "Emma, darling, you actually found something appropriate. I'm impressed." The words landed like backhanded slaps, praise that poisoned, compliments that cut. Robert materialized beside them, bourbon already warming his veins. "Let's get you a drink, son," he said, steering James away before Emma could protest. "The men need to discuss some things." And just like that, she was alone, surrounded by 100 strangers who looked at her like she was a stain on their expensive upholstery, an error in their carefully curated social equation. Patricia's sister, Diane, drifted closer with a smile that mirrored her siblings' cruelty. "So brave of you," she stage-whispered, "marrying up like this. Most girls in your position would at least try to hide it better." Emma's phone sat heavy in her clutch, already connected to a call she'd initiated the moment they'd pulled up to the venue, her father's voice silent on the other end but listening, recording, waiting. "I'm not hiding anything," Emma said softly, and she wasn't, not anymore. Patricia's glass clinked against crystal, the sound that would signal the beginning of the end. "Everyone," she called out, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade through silk. "I have an announcement to make." The room fell silent. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, adrenaline flooding her system. But her face remained calm, serene, almost curious. "Here it comes," she thought. Patricia's eyes glittered with malicious triumph. "I think it's time we all saw exactly what kind of woman has trapped my son into marriage." Phones emerged from pockets and purses, 100 cameras ready to record, to witness, to immortalize whatever was about to happen. Emma felt hands grab her shoulders, Diane on one side, Robert materializing on the other, and she didn't resist, didn't fight, just stood perfectly still as Patricia's voice rose to a shriek. "This gold digger has been lying about everything. Let's see what she's really hiding under that dress she probably stole." The fabric tore with a sound like ripping silk, expensive, irreversible, caught on a dozen cameras that would upload to the internet before the pieces hit the floor. Emma stood there as her carefully chosen dress fell away in strips, the Valentino reduced to ruins at her feet while Patricia screamed about poverty and deception and all the sins she'd invented to justify this moment. The crowd gasped, some in horror, some in savage delight, all of them recording, documenting, bearing witness to what they thought was a public execution. But Emma didn't crumble, didn't collapse the way Patricia had expected. Instead, tears streaming down her face, she smiled, a small, knowing expression that made Patricia falter mid-rant. "What are you smiling about?" Patricia demanded, her voice cracking with confusion and rage. Emma lifted her phone, still clutched in her hand throughout the assault, and spoke clearly into it, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "Yes, father. They've finally shown their true colors." Patricia's face drained of blood. "What? Who are you talking to?" "He'll be here in 10 minutes, Emma continued, her voice steady despite the tears, despite the humiliation, despite everything. "I think you should stay for this, Patricia. You're going to want to see what happens next." The room erupted in confused murmurs, guests looking at each other, trying to understand what had shifted, what invisible line had just been crossed. James finally found his voice, pushing through the crowd. "Emma, But the words died when he saw her face, the expression there that he'd never seen before, not broken, not defeated, but triumphant in a way that made his blood run cold. "Do you want to know why I never told you about my family?" Emma asked softly, looking at him with something like pity. "Why I wore Target clothes and drove that old Honda? Why I lived in that apartment with the broken radiator?" He stared at her, comprehension dawning too late. "Because I wanted to know if you'd love me when you thought I had nothing. If you'd stand up for me when it cost you something. If you'd choose me over them when it mattered." She gestured at his parents, at the crowd, at the ruins of the life she'd built to test him. "You failed, James. Every single time, you failed." The sound started then, distant but growing closer, a rhythmic thunder that made the crystal chandeliers tremble, helicopter blades cutting through Manhattan air, growing louder with each passing second. Patricia's legs gave out. She grabbed the edge of a table for support. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." "Oh yes," Emma said, and her smile was no longer small, no longer uncertain. "Let me introduce you to my father." The rooftop access doors burst open, security guards in tactical gear, followed by men in expensive suits, followed by a woman carrying a garment bag and briefcase. And then, backlit by the Manhattan skyline, David Chen stepped into the room. Someone in the crowd gasped. That's David Chen. The billionaire. Chen Industries. Another voice. Forbes put him at $8 billion last year. He owns half of Silicon Valley. Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal. David's gaze swept the room with the calm of a man who'd bought and sold bigger things than this venue, than these people, than their entire social circle combined, then locked onto his daughter, standing in a borrowed tablecloth, surrounded by the ruins of her destroyed dress. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went absolutely cold. "Emma," he said quietly, crossing to her in 3 strides. His assistant immediately draped a Hermes cashmere coat over her shoulders, the coat alone worth more than Patricia's car. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad," she said, and her voice broke just slightly on the word. "They showed me exactly who they are." David nodded once, then turned to face the Morrisons with the kind of attention that made corporate executives resign and stock prices plummet. "You just assaulted my daughter," he said, each word precise as a scalpel. "On camera, in front of 100 witnesses." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, no sound emerging, just the slow dawning horror of someone realizing they'd burned down their own house while standing inside it. David's voice remained conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "That cheap dress you destroyed was a vintage Valentino worth $50,000. One of many she wore to see if your family could love her for who she is, not what she has." He pulled out his phone, a simple gesture that made Robert flinch like he'd drawn a weapon. "Execute it," David said into the device, and somewhere in the room, James's phone buzzed. James pulled it out with shaking hands, his face going gray as he read. I'm fired. My venture capital fund owns controlling shares in your pharmaceutical company," David explained, his tone professorial, almost kind. 48%, to be exact. We acquired them 6 months ago." He paused. "Let that sink in. Around the time Emma told me she'd found someone she thought might be worth the risk." Patricia's phone lit up next, a cascade of notifications that made her hands tremble. "Eviction notice," she whispered, scrolling with mounting horror. "But we own that apartment." "No," David corrected gently. "I own that building. Purchased it through an LLC last December. My lawyers tell me you're 3 months behind on maintenance fees, which gives me legal grounds for immediate removal." Robert tried to order a drink, his usual escape, but his credit card declined with a beep that echoed through the silent room. The bartender looked apologetic. "Sir, it says to call your bank." "My PR team released the assault video 3 minutes ago," David continued, addressing the room now, his voice carrying effortlessly. "It's already trending on social media. CNN will pick it up within the hour. We have contacts there." He turned to Emma, and something in his expression softened. Not the billionaire now, just a father looking at his daughter. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, sweetheart. You asked me to wait, to let you handle this, and I did. But the moment they touched you—" "I know, Dad." Emma's voice cracked, the armor she'd worn for 6 months finally fracturing. "Thank you for trusting me." "Always," he said, and pulled her into an embrace that smelled like home, like safety, like every Sunday morning in Malibu when the world had been simpler and she hadn't yet learned that love could be conditional. Behind them, Patricia collapsed into a chair, hyperventilating. Robert tried to lunge forward. Whether to attack or beg, no one would ever know. But David's security caught him mid-stride, held him with professional efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. And James just stood there, phone still clutched in his hand, watching his entire life disintegrate in real time. "Emma, please," he finally managed. "I didn't know who you were. I love you." Emma pulled back from her father, turned to face her ex-fiancé, with eyes that had cried all their tears and found something harder beneath. "You knew exactly who I was, James. A woman who loved you. A woman who needed you to stand up for her. I tried. You whispered apologies in the dark and said nothing when it mattered." Her voice was steady now, surgical. "That's why I never told you about my father. I wanted someone strong enough to love me without his money, without his power, without his shadow making everything easier." She gestured at the ruins around them, his parents broken, his job gone, his future collapsing. "You failed every test I gave you. Not because you didn't know I was rich, but because you didn't think I was worth defending when you thought I was poor." James's face crumpled, not with remorse, Emma realized with bitter clarity, but with the understanding of what he'd lost in practical terms. the connection, the money, the life he'd been imagining. "I can change," he said, the words tumbling out desperate and hollow. "Give me another chance, I'll stand up to them, I'll—" "You had 6 months of chances," Emma interrupted, her voice quiet but absolute. "Every dinner where your mother called me a stray. Every party where your father joked about my poverty. Every moment you chose their approval over my dignity." She shook her head slowly. "You don't get to find your spine now that you know my last name opens doors." Patricia finally found her voice, shrill, breaking. "You manipulated him. You lied about who you were. You trapped my son with your deception." David's assistant opened the briefcase with a soft click that somehow silenced Patricia mid-sentence. "The prenuptial agreement your son signed," she said, pulling out a leather folder. "Page 4 to 7, Clause 16, the humiliation provision." James's face went blank. "What provision?" "The one you didn't read," Emma said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, just tired resignation. "If either party subjects the other to public humiliation or assault, they forfeit their claim to any shared assets and pay punitive damages." She paused. $5 million, to be exact. The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "I don't have $5 million, James whispered. "No," David agreed. "You don't. My lawyers estimate it'll take you approximately 43 years to pay it off on a median salary, assuming you can find employment after tonight's video goes viral." He tilted his head slightly. "McDonald's is hiring, I checked. They have an excellent training program." Robert finally broke free from security, not to attack, but to collapse at David's feet, hands clasped in supplication. "Please, you have to understand, we didn't know, if we'd known who she was." "That's exactly the problem," David said, looking down at him with something like pity. "You would have treated her like royalty if you'd known she had money. You treated her like garbage because you thought she didn't." He crouched down, met Robert's eyes at level. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character." He stood, brushed invisible dust from his Tom Ford suit. "My lawyers are filing charges for assault, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The video evidence is incontrovertible. You physically attacked my daughter in front of 100 witnesses, many of whom were kind enough to record the assault from multiple angles." Patricia let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. "We'll fight this. We have lawyers." "I have 37 lawyers," David said calmly. "On retainer. They cost more per hour than your house is worth." He gestured to the crowd, many of whom were still recording. "I also own this venue, which means I have access to all security footage. Those of you who recorded tonight, thank you. Your footage will be subpoenaed as evidence. Those of you who watched and did nothing." His gaze swept the room, making eye contact with people who suddenly found their shoes fascinating. "You'll be asked to testify." The enormity of it settled over the Morrisons like concrete. Their son fired, their home gone, their bank accounts frozen, their social standing shattered, and now criminal charges with video evidence and 100 witnesses. Patricia grabbed Emma's arm, a last desperate attempt at, what? Apology. Negotiation. Her nails dug in hard enough to leave marks. Security moved immediately, but David held up a hand. "Let her speak." Patricia's face was streaked with mascara, her careful makeup ruined by tears and panic. "Please," she choked out. "I was wrong, I see that now. We'll apologize. Publicly, we'll do whatever you want." "You were wrong 6 months ago," Emma said, gently removing Patricia's hand from her arm. "You were wrong at every dinner, every party, every moment you looked at me like I was trash. You're not sorry you hurt me, Patricia. You're sorry I turned out to be someone who could hurt you back." The truth of it landed like a physical blow. Patricia stumbled backward, caught herself on a table. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" David asked his daughter. Emma nodded, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline draining away, leaving only the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting for too long. "Yes, please." As they turned toward the exit, James called out one last time. "Emma, wait." She paused, looked back over her shoulder. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Not love, not anymore, but maybe the ghost of what love had been before it died from neglect. "I really did love you," she said quietly. "The you I thought you were. The you I hoped you could be." She shook her head slowly. "But you chose comfort over courage, every single time. That's not the kind of love I want to build a life on." "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, and the question was so nakedly helpless it was almost pitiable. "Grow a spine," Emma said. "Learn to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you something. Become the kind of man who deserves real love, not conditional affection based on social approval. She paused at the door. Maybe start by standing up to your parents. It's about 20 years too late, but better late than never. The helicopter waited on the roof, rotors already spinning, ready to lift them above this mess, above this failure, above the ruins of what might have been. Emma didn't look back again. The helicopter lifted into Manhattan's night sky, the city sprawling beneath them in geometric patterns of light and shadow. Millions of lives continuing below while Emma's old one burned to ash in a ballroom she'd never see again. David sat beside her in silence, giving her space to process, to breathe, to simply exist without performance or pretense for the first time in 6 months. "You could have told me sooner," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the rotors. "I would have ended this the first time she called you a stray." "I know." Emma leaned her head against the window, watching the Hudson River snake between boroughs like a dark ribbon. "But I needed to know if he'd choose me without knowing who I was. I needed to see if love could exist without your shadow making everything easier. And now you know. Now I know." She closed her eyes, felt the weight of that knowledge settle into her bones, bitter and necessary, the kind of truth that hurt because it mattered. He loved the idea of me. The grateful girlfriend who'd be so thankful for his family's acceptance that she'd tolerate anything. But the moment standing up for me cost him something. She broke off, swallowed hard. He chose comfort every single time. David's hand found hers, squeezed once. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know that doesn't make it hurt less." "No," she agreed. "But it makes it clearer." The helicopter banked toward Teterboro Airport where David's private jet waited, ready to carry them back to California, back to Malibu, back to the life she'd left behind to chase something real. "What happens to them now?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know, didn't want to carry their destruction alongside her own pain. "The legal process will take months," David said carefully. "The assault charges alone carry significant consequences. The video is already viral, trending on every platform. Patricia and Robert will face criminal prosecution. James's termination was legal and documented. The eviction will proceed through proper channels." He paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone who'd learned that power required responsibility. "They'll survive, Emma. They'll have to rebuild, learn some humility, maybe become better people. But they'll survive. And if they don't, become better people, I mean, then they'll be exactly who they always were, just with less money to hide it behind." Emma thought about Patricia's face as the truth had dawned. Not remorse, just panic at being caught, exposed, stripped of the social armor she'd spent decades constructing. "She was only sorry she got caught," Emma whispered. "Not sorry she hurt me." "I know." David's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen that pattern before, in business partners and ex-wives and people who measured worth in dollars and social standing. Some people only understand consequences, never remorse. The jet appeared below them, sleek and waiting, cabin lights warm against the tarmac darkness. Emma felt herself begin to fracture now that safety was imminent, the control she'd maintained for 6 months finally cracking as adrenaline gave way to exhaustion. "I really thought he'd choose me," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "I thought if I was patient enough, good enough, if I loved him hard enough." "Oh, sweetheart." David pulled her into his arms as the helicopter descended, held her while she finally let herself cry, not the strategic tears she'd shed in the ballroom, but real ones, messy and painful and necessary. "His failure to choose you says everything about him and nothing about you." "Then why does it feel like I failed?" "Because you hoped better of him." "That's not failure, Emma. That's faith. And the fact that you can still have faith after watching your mother and my marriages fall apart." He pulled back, met her eyes. "That's not weakness. That's the strongest thing about you." The helicopter touched down with barely a tremor. The door opened to reveal David's assistant holding a tablet, her expression apologetic. "Sir, the media requests are already flooding in. TMZ has the video, CNN wants a statement, Anne." "Handle it," David said simply. Standard response, "Ms. Chen has no comment at this time. The matter is with our legal team, and any further questions should be directed to our attorneys." He helped Emma down onto the tarmac. "We're going home." 6 months later, Emma stood on the Malibu cliffs watching the Pacific crash against rocks that had weathered millennia of storms, constant, enduring, proof that some things survived even the worst devastation. The New York Times engagement announcement had run that morning, tasteful and simple, Emma Chen, daughter of tech entrepreneur David Chen, to marry Daniel Rodriguez, COO of Chen Industries, in a private ceremony at the family's California estate. She'd met Daniel years ago at one of her father's company retreats, before Princeton, before James, before she'd learned the hard way that hiding who you were only attracted people who'd love you for the wrong reasons. He'd known her identity from the beginning, had watched her walk away from privilege with something like admiration, and had simply waited. Not pursued, not pushed, just waited with the patience of someone who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. "You're thinking about him," Daniel said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee, hers with oat milk and honey, the details remembered without asking. "About all of them," Emma admitted. "Patricia saw the announcement. She's working retail in Newark now. My assistant saw her at a department store, recognized her from the video." "How do you feel about that?" Emma considered the question, watching gulls wheel against clouds that promised rain. "Sad, mostly. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just sad that it had to come to that. That they couldn't learn without losing everything first." "Some people can't," Daniel said quietly. "They build their whole identity on the wrong things, status, appearance, what others think. When that gets stripped away, there's nothing underneath." "James tried to reach out," Emma continued. 3 emails, 2 letters, even showed up at the office once. Security turned him away. "Do you want to respond?" "No." The answer came easier than she'd expected. His apologizing to the Emma he wishes I'd been, the billionaire's daughter who'll rescue him from consequences. Not the woman he actually met, the one he failed to defend. She sipped her coffee, felt its warmth spread through her chest. "I hope he finds someone who helps him become better. I hope his parents learn something from this. But that's not my responsibility anymore." Daniel nodded, didn't push, just stood beside her in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that didn't need filling, that felt like partnership rather than performance. "I'm terrified," Emma admitted suddenly, "of getting it wrong again, of my judgment being broken." "Your judgment isn't broken," Daniel said. "You saw the best in someone and gave them chances to rise to it. The fact that James chose not to isn't a reflection on your ability to love, it's a reflection on his ability to be loved." "When did you get so wise?" "I've had a good teacher." He smiled, gestured back toward the house where her father was probably pacing the study, already nervous about the wedding despite being 3 months away. "Your dad's been teaching me what it looks like to love someone enough to let them make their own mistakes. Even when it hurts to watch. Especially then." Emma leaned into him, let herself be held by someone who'd proven, not through grand gestures but through consistent, daily choices, that he'd stand beside her regardless of circumstances. "The video's still making rounds," she said. "Over 50 million views now. Patricia's face has become a meme. When you realize you messed with the wrong person. Internet justice is brutal." "She chose brutality first," Emma said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, just acknowledgement. "She weaponized public humiliation, recorded it for entertainment. The fact that it backfired doesn't make her the victim." Her phone buzzed, a text from her father. "Chef wants to know if you're staying for dinner. He's making your favorite." Emma smiled, texted back a quick yes, then pocketed the phone. "James wrote in one of his emails that I trapped him," she said. "That the prenup was predatory, that I deliberately set him up to fail." "Did you?" "I gave him a choice at every moment," Emma said firmly. "Stand up for me or stay silent. Choose courage or comfort. Love me enough to defend me or prioritize his family's approval." She shook her head. "He chose wrong every single time. That's not a trap. That's a test he failed because of who he is, not because of what I did. And now? Now I'm choosing someone who doesn't need testing," Emma said, turning to face Daniel fully. "Someone who's already proven, over years, not months, that he sees me clearly and loves what he sees. Someone who doesn't need my father's money to value me, doesn't need my suffering to find his courage." Daniel's expression softened. "I'm honored to be that person." "You better be," Emma said with a smile that finally reached her eyes. "Because I'm done settling for men who need to be taught basic decency. I want partnership, not a project." They walked back toward the house together, the Malibu estate sprawling before them, home in a way that Princeton apartment never was, never could be. Emma had left this place seeking authenticity, had found betrayal instead, and had somehow returned with harder-won wisdom about the difference between hiding and protecting yourself. Inside, her father waited with worry etched into the lines around his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, the same question he'd asked 1,000 times since that Manhattan night. "I'm okay," Emma said, and meant it this time. Actually okay, not just surviving. David pulled her into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and unconditional love. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. For trying, for trusting, for knowing when to walk away. I learned from the best, Emma said against his shoulder. Emma chose to trust again after betrayal. Could you? Drop a comment and let me know. How do you rebuild faith in love after someone breaks it? 3 months later, Emma married Daniel on the Malibu cliffs with the Pacific as witness and a guest list that included people who'd known her before the money mattered, during the test, and after the truth emerged, people who'd proven their love wasn't conditional on her last name or bank balance. Patricia Morrison didn't receive an invitation, but she saw the photos online, published by Vogue with Emma's permission, the images capturing a bride who glowed with genuine joy, not the performance of it. The caption read, Tech heiress Emma Chen marries COO Daniel Rodriguez in intimate Malibu ceremony. Patricia sat in her Newark studio apartment, the only place she could afford after legal fees and judgments, and stared at the photos for a long time. Emma's dress was Vera Wang, her smile was radiant, her happiness was palpable even through pixels and screens. Everything Patricia had tried to destroy had not only survived but flourished without her poison to taint it. She closed the laptop, looked around her diminished life, and finally, perhaps for the first time, understood the cost of cruelty. Not the financial consequences, not the social exile, but the deeper truth. She'd been offered a chance to love someone genuinely kind, genuinely good, and she'd chosen spite instead. Some lessons come too late to change the outcome, but maybe, if she was lucky, not too late to change the person. Meanwhile, on those Malibu cliffs, Emma danced with her husband as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors that promised tomorrow would be different, better, real. She'd been stripped of dignity in a Manhattan ballroom, exposed and humiliated, reduced to a spectacle for strangers' entertainment. But she'd stood up, dusted herself off, and reclaimed not just her dignity but her faith that real love, the kind that chose you every day, that stood beside you in crisis, that didn't need your wealth to see your worth, actually existed. The Morrisons had tried to break her. Instead, they'd proven her unbreakable. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.